More than 70 years have passed since Vietnam endured the invasion of France and became a part of the Indo-Chinese Union. It has been 70 years of violence, exploitation, and poverty. The Vietnamese people have suffered for too long, too much. Despite numerous efforts by the Vietnamese to gain independence, nothing changed. The French were still occupied, still oppressed, still impoverished. The Vietnamese hoped for a savior, someone to bring liberation from the darkness. In 1911, in Saigon within the Indo-Chinese Union, a 21-year-old Vietnamese youth boarded the ship Latouche-Treville. He carried with him the aspiration to seek a new path for his people to achieve independence, a path for poor farmers to rise above colonial rule. That's when he discovered communism. In 1930, in Hong Kong under British rule, the 21-year-old youth became a middle-aged man and a member of an communist international organization. There he united 3 communist organizations in Vietnam into one and founded the Communist Party of Vietnam. In 1941, he returned to Vietnam after 30 years of wandering to directly lead the communist movement within the country. In 1942, he went to China seeking assistance from the government of the Republic of China. From this point on, he used a name that to this day evokes different emotions among the Vietnamese, the French, and the Americans: Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was arrested by Chiang Kai-shek's government of the Republic of China for espionage. Later, due to pressure from the United States, he was released and returned to Vietnam. Meanwhile, significant changes were taking place in the negotiations of the people the Vietnamese wanted to overthrow. World War II erupted, and France fell into the hands of the Axis powers led by Germany. Japan, Germany's ally in Asia, took advantage of this opportunity to expand its territory in Indochina. The Vietnamese not only suffered from French oppression but also bore the additional pressure from the Japanese. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh organization he founded sided with the Allies to resist the Japanese. The Americans, key members of the Allies and engaged in direct combat with Japan in the Pacific, supported this. They assisted the Viet Minh with military training and provided weapons. In this photo, you can see Ho Chi Minh, General Vo Nguyen Giap, and other members of the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, OSS, intelligence agency. And here, in 1915, is Ho Chi Minh's Declaration of Independence, in which he quotes the U.S. Declaration of Independence of 1776 as evidence for his cause. Ho Chi Minh respected the United States and never saw them as colonial oppressors like France. It was an unlikely alliance that few could imagine. But could it last long? In May 1945, the European front of World War II ended. Hitler's Nazi regime collapsed. 3 months later, the United States used the first 2 atomic bombs in human history to attack Japan, forcing them to surrender unconditionally. Taking advantage of the political vacuum after Japan surrendered, Ho Chi Minh organized the August Revolution and officially declared the establishment of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam just a few days later. The 3 anti-Axis allies convened to discuss the new shape of the world after the victory. Here, different relationships began to emerge. President Roosevelt of the United States hoped Vietnam would be granted independence to its indigenous people rather than reverting to French colonial rule. Would Ho Chi Minh's and the Vietnamese people's aspirations finally become a reality? No. President Roosevelt passed away before witnessing the victory of the war he led. His successor was President Truman, a completely different person. Truman was not interested in the independence movements of colonial countries, and France returned to Vietnam. Truman was not Roosevelt, and he lacked influence in a world like Roosevelt's. During World War II on the European front, the Soviet Union incorporated many countries into its territory during the liberation of Eastern Europe, creating a powerful force on the international stage. Truman and Churchill were not pleased with this. Unlike Roosevelt, Truman did not trust Stalin, and Churchill had always been anti-communist. If you recall the Russian Civil War nearly 30 years ago, Britain sent troops to support the White Army in their confrontation with the Bolsheviks, and Churchill was one of the prominent figures in this endeavor. However, as they entered World War II, the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States all had common goals and enemies. They fought together and ultimately, together won the war. However, after the goals were achieved, distrust and animosity resurfaced. Stalin's continuous expansion westward infuriated Churchill and Truman. The Western nations were weakened after the war, and if the Soviet Union turned around and invaded the West, they wouldn't be able to resist. Thus, Churchill wanted the Eastern European countries to become a neutral buffer zone between the two sides. But with Stalin's actions, the divide between the two sides became an iron curtain. Meanwhile, Truman was also staunchly anti-communist. In his eyes, Stalin was another version of Hitler, no different. Moreover, Stalin's expansionist policies were spreading to Iran, Turkey, and Greece, countries crucial to America in the Middle East and the Mediterranean, which angered Truman further. For this reason, he decided to implement the Marshall Plan to support the economic recovery of Western countries, aiming to prevent further communist expansion westward. The world had just gone through a war, but immediately a new war began. War re-emerged with two sides, the socialist bloc of the Soviet Union and the anti-communist bloc of the United States and the West. These successive events began to nurture an idea, a theory in Truman's mind, the domino theory. After the war with Japan ended in China, the civil war between the Kuomintang government and Mao Zedong's communist forces continued. Truman's government not only distrusted the Kuomintang, but also did not provide much support to the government. The Republic of China failed and was forced to flee to Taiwan. In 1949, Mao Zedong declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China, a severe blow to Truman's administration. The most populous country in the world fell into the hands of the communist faction. Even after leaving the presidency, Truman was still criticized by his successor Eisenhower for not supporting the Kuomintang government and ultimately losing China. Barely recovering from the first blow by Mao Zedong, Truman received another blow. He was shocked to see North Korean troops led by Kim Il-sung, a leader supported by the communist faction, invade South Korea, a state he had supported. In this one, we'll just highlight how the madness of this war changed the world. Truman didn't blame Kim Il-sung. He blamed the Soviets for instigating the conflict. This Korean War set a standard in the wars of the Cold War era. The two superpowers, the USSR and the US, wouldn't directly confront each other, instead pouring money, weapons, and troops into their respective sides of the conflict. The war also set a goal for both sides. Any nation falling into the hands of the other was a failure. Mao Zedong's support for Kim Il-sung also made Truman realize that communist regimes could use force to achieve their goals. Look at the map. These are the countries falling into the hands of the USSR. What do they have in common? They are close to each other, and so, one by one, each country fell into communist hands, like dominoes falling because the one before it fell. This reinforces what we believe. Communism can spread. If one country falls into communism, the countries around it will fall into their hands too. When it comes to communism, who stands at its helm? That's exactly how the domino theory emerged. Suddenly, Vietnam, a country that had suffered under colonial rule, became a special concern of the Truman administration. But why Vietnam? Vietnam lies right below China. Right after the People's Republic of China was established, Mao Zedong began providing assistance to the Viet Minh in their fight for independence from the returning French colonial forces. Putting the domino theory into this context, China had fallen, North Korea had fallen, Vietnam would fall, then Laos, Cambodia, and eventually this whole Southeast Asian and Asian region would fall to communism. And the person sitting in the Kremlin laughed out loud. Moreover, Southeast Asia is a region rich in resources and is a vital transportation route for the U.S. Losing Vietnam would be a major disaster for Truman. They could lose the Cold War just a few years after it began. At the White House, no one accepted this fate. So, the top priority now was to prevent Vietnam from falling into the hands of Ho Chi Minh's communist government, who was once an ally against the Japanese. However, learning from what happened in Korea, the U.S. would not directly engage in the conflict. Furthermore, they would turn to their allies in the West who were willing and able to support them in the fight against the Viet Minh. All of this led to a series of defeats, with the ultimate shock at Dien Bien Phu and the subsequent collapse of an empire. The French failed and had to sit at the negotiation table in Geneva. Here, the parties involved agreed to temporarily divide Vietnam along the 17th parallel. The Geneva Accords granted temporary control of North Vietnam to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh, while the South would be held by the State of Vietnam. For those wondering, the State of Vietnam was a pro-French government established during the return of the French colonial rule, led by former Emperor Bao Dai and former top advisors of the Ho Chi Minh government serving as prime minister. Viet Minh forces in the south would withdraw to the north, while French forces in the north would withdraw to the south. People from both sides were also allowed to freely move to whichever side they desired within 300 days. Hundreds of thousands of people, especially Catholics, chose to move to the south because they did not want to live under communist rule. After everything was arranged, in July 1956, both North and South would hold general elections to unify the country. At that time, no party was entirely happy with the Geneva Accords. The French, of course, were forced to withdraw from their colonial territories after a painful defeat spanning centuries. Meanwhile, the communist government in Hanoi was also dissatisfied because, after years of fighting, they remained divided and had to wait for 2 years to organize general elections. While Hanoi wanted to use force to completely drive French forces out of the South, however, the two elder brothers of the Socialist bloc did not want that to happen. China, after the Korean War, did not want to get involved in a new war, and the Soviet Union did not want increased tensions that could lead to direct U.S. involvement in the conflict. The Soviet Union warned that they would cut aid to the Ho Chi Minh government if he did not comply. Although Hanoi remained confident of winning this general election, with strong support for Ho Chi Minh from the people, the reality fell short of expectations. However, this dissatisfaction cannot compare to the disappointment of these two, the United States and this man. The U.S. foresaw that the general election 2 years later would end with Ho Chi Minh's overwhelming victory. This was predicted by the incoming President Eisenhower regarding North Vietnam. This meant that Vietnam would fall into communist hands and trigger a domino effect in Southeast Asia. A comprehensive failure against the Soviet Union loomed ahead. The second person extremely angered was Diem. Ngo Dinh Diem simply detested every regime holding power in the South. He hated Bao Dai because he was pro-French, while Diem pursued anti-colonialism. He also hated Ho Chi Minh because, simply put, Diem was a staunch anti-communist. Diem wanted South Vietnam to be under his rule. However, there were some challenges that Diem had to overcome on his path to supreme power in Saigon. Viet Minh forces were still present in Saigon, ready for the general election. French troops had not completely withdrawn, and many areas were still controlled by religious groups. However, the most important issue was in Saigon, where the Binh Xuyen, a notorious criminal organization backed by the French, even with its own army, controlled a large part of the city. Diem rolled up his sleeves and thought, "It's time to crush them all." Diem felt proud when he defeated the Bin Suyen army in a bloody battle in Saigon in 1955. He also succeeded in persuading some leaders and officials to join his side, while also preventing the spread of the Viet Minh and communism. After overthrowing Bao Dai's government, Diem tightened his grip on power in Saigon. The battle in Saigon in 1955 increased his credibility among the people of South Vietnam, as he successfully eliminated the last remnants of French influence in the region. Diem promised a democratic regime, contrasting with the communist regime in the north, where land reforms were carried out brutally. Diem's actions reflected what the U.S. wanted to see in South Vietnam, a government resisting the spread of communism all the way to Saigon. Despite not all Americans trusting Diem, he managed to garner their support. Faced with Diem's popularity in Saigon, the Americans had no choice but to support him. With the backing of the U.S., Diem organized a referendum to decide whether he or Bao Dai would lead the government of South Vietnam. Despite the seemingly predictable outcome, Diem still needed to take steps to ensure that the result would be seen as fair and legitimate. Ultimately, even the Americans advised Diem that they knew he would rig the election, but not to make it too obvious. However, Diem did not heed anyone's advice. He made the decision himself. With a support rate of 98.91%, a figure too large to not raise suspicions of fraud. With Bao Dai overthrown and replaced by the new government of the Republic of Vietnam under the leadership of the new president Ngo Dinh Diem, the Americans achieved what they wanted in Vietnam, at least at that time. They believed that strong support for the new government would prevent the expansion of the Soviet Union and China in Southeast Asia, and the domino effect might not occur. However, they did not know that their support for Diem in South Vietnam would kickstart one of the most history-changing conflicts for the United States. Diem would be the central figure in the subsequent events of the Vietnam War.